Okay. Uh, Good evening to everyone. Hello. This is the first edition of Talking Heads, a talk show that we hope to hold almost all Thursday evenings, where we invite a variety of different people to talk about politics and to just engage in interesting discussions. This evening, I have with me us Craig Murray, former ambassador and human rights activist, who has been nice enough to join us this evening, and also Michael Gray, who is a journalist with the Common Space website. So again, the format is very loosely, based, but there's a few discussions that we'd like to get into this evening on both. So I guess the format that I'd like to put out is to put out to put out a subject and then have each of us talk about it to some degree, and to get to get a maximum insight on it. So first of all, I really wanted to talk, especially getting Craig's perspective on this, having worked in the British government as an ambassador and dealing with other countries in that capacity, is the almost inevitable now EU referendum on whether or not the UK will belong to it, and then also the threat to withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights. And I understand that was not actually in the Queen's speech, so maybe that threat has been alleviated for the time being. But just to begin with you, Craig, besides the demagoguery that you heard from Nigel Farage and others about how horrible the EU is and how many regulations that imposes, what do you think is the main impetus that pushes why is it that so many people in the UK have a problem with being in the EU enough to perhaps want to leave? How do you see it?
I think I really do think a primary driver is xenophobic. There are not very many internationalists with a wide worldview who want to leave the EU. There are a few. There are a few. By chance, I was speaking in a debate a few years ago with a guy called Alan Sked, who actually founded UKIP, who genuinely felt that being in the EU didn't allow you to adopt social policies. And there's a certain amount of truth in that. One of the things that needs reforming is the EU needs to be a less dogmatically neoliberal organisation. Sked left UKIP. He left a party he founded himself, and it got taken over by Farage and a bunch of sort of racist nutters. But there are a few decent anti-EU people around, Sked being one of them. But by and large, the vast majority of people who are anti-EU are basically xenophobic. They don't like foreigners, and that's their fundamental motivation. It's not the most rational of movements by and large, and I think that will become obvious as the debate develops.
For renegotiating the EU treaty is to be able to put more firm limits on EU immigration into the UK. But then again, you also have well over several million UK citizens living in the EU. I mean, what happens to them? I mean, do you see that there's been any thought given to that whatsoever?
The whole idea of limitation of freedom of movement of labour is peculiar if you have a system which is entirely predicated on the free movement of the other factors of production. If you have free movement of capital and free movement of goods, it makes very little sense to restrict the free movement of labour. And this is the Conservatives playing to the anti-immigration xenophobic gallery. In fact, there's no way at all that the free movement of labour is renegotiable. It's not going to be possible to renegotiate that. What they might be able to do is to agree some restrictions on benefit access, but that won't be as easy as it sounds either. That may well be benefit access not by nationality, but by residence, in that you will have to have been resident for so many years before you can pick up benefit. But that would have to apply to UK nationals coming back as well, for example. It would have to be a proper residence criteria, not a national criteria. But tax credits, probably not. They probably won't. That's probably not doable because basically any kind of in-work benefit has to be a level playing field for EU citizens within the movement of labour. So the chances of the Conservatives actually being able to gain anything in renegotiation that's substantial on the movement of labour are vanishingly small. It's just not going to happen. So precisely how they're going to dress up, because what Cameron wants to do is obtain a few concessions and then go to the country saying, look, aren't I great? I obtained these concessions, therefore you should vote to stay in. But he's going to find it very, very hard to make his concessions look like anything changed.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Your perspective on EU in-out referendum. How do you see it, especially and also tell us a little bit about your experience. You're in London now, and how have you been? Tell us a little bit about your experience so far.
The first question is the EU, and I agree broadly with what Craig was saying, that the issues that Cameron's looking to negotiate on, freedom of movement and access to social security, are areas where he's unlikely to make huge gains or achieve huge changes. And even if he did achieve huge changes, I don't think those would necessarily be beneficial for many people living in Scotland. It would be good to actually have a real debate about the European Union on issues like, labour standards, environmental standards, how the EU could promote greater levels of sort of security and equality across the continent. But I think we're going to miss that opportunity because the debate and the negotiations are going to be dominated by the Conservatives and pressure from UKIP. So hopefully we'll have a different type of discussion in Scotland about how we see the relationship with the European Union. And I suppose it's down to everyone involved in politics in Scotland to take that different approach to the discussion. Secondly, about my holiday, I've been down in Westminster doing some interviews and reporting with Common Space the last couple of days. And yesterday, obviously, I was there for the pageantry, the carriages and soldiers and monarchs for the Queen's speech, and all the 20+ pieces of legislation that are being proposed. And today I was around Westminster talking to a few different MPs, talking to Liberty about their campaign to save the Human Rights Act and on civil liberties issues.
We'll get to that definitely. Yeah, but please continue. Yeah.
And taking in the debate that was in the Commons tonight on Trident safety at Faslane. And it's certainly quite an eye-opening experience for someone who's really only been near the Commons as a tourist. When you go in sort of in a press capacity, and you sort of see the halls and the grandeur and the security and the whole sort of state apparatus and all the institutions that make up the UK government, you can understand why it's probably quite could potentially intimidating for new people who are coming in from smaller parties to try and change that culture. You see all the kind of tiny nonsensical pressures that there's already been on sort of how the SNP behave, about where you clap and where you sit, which I
find that bizarre.
Which are incredibly shallow, but of course it relates to the pre-existing system and its customs and its norms and its rules, and when they follow the rules and when they possibly consider breaking those rules, because it is a very antiquated, very strange way of doing government, and they're going to have that challenge of trying to appear constructive while also trying to challenge the system that they don't support.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the next issue, and that is the possibility of withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights. And obviously, Britain is a signatory for that. And from kind of an American perspective, I mean, the idea, we're going to withdraw the Bill of Rights. I mean, that would just be absolutely, heretical, to say the least. I mean, the freedom of speech, all these, the freedoms that have been bestowed through the Bill of Rights. And I was talking to I met a friend of mine who's a professor of law in England, and he was telling me that human rights are viewed differently. Maybe I don't know whether it's different between England and Scotland, but in the UK, human rights are almost seen as somewhat things that are given to criminals and asylum seekers and all these people, but not something that affects kind of average, upright citizens. And I was just wondering on your take on that, not having lived for any great length in the UK, how are human rights perceived? I mean, are they seen as the foundations of civil society, or are they seen as these kind of frivolous things that protect criminals or something like that?
I think sadly, it's true that to a very large swathe of the population, they are seen as frivolous things that protect criminals because of absolutely disgraceful long-running campaigns in our right-wing media, particularly the Mail and the Express, which portray them in nothing but that. Sky News yesterday, I think, had a little item on the Human Rights Act and whether it should be repealed, and they started by interviewing a poor gentleman whose daughter had been killed in a traffic accident by an asylum seeker, as though that was anything to do with the Human Rights Act. Because, it isn't. But this idea that immigrants and asylum seekers kill people, and that's all to do with Human Rights Act, and that's what human rights are about, is something. And you would have to have a really warped mind to lead an item on the Human Rights Act with an interview with that gentleman. But that is the extraordinarily unreal universe that our media lives in, and the mindset that it foists upon people. It worries me a great deal, frankly. It worries me that there was much less pushback, for example, in the UK about Edward Snowden's revelations there was in the United States. People here seem very much more comfortable with the idea of enormous levels of state surveillance. We have lost to a very great degree in much of the United Kingdom a feeling of necessity for free space, for free personal space, for free political space, for free expression. Now, I do detect a rather healthier attitude in Scotland than in England, having lived in both in the last few years. And I do detect, just as there's more support for the European Union in Scotland and in England, I do detect that there's more concern and more understanding of the basic requirement for human rights to protect us from abuse by government in Scotland. I'm not sure that's something you could actually measure.
Okay. Michael, do you have anything to add on to that?
Lots. There's at least, I suppose, like 3 points to make. Well, one's a broad one, just about the Queen's speech. If you were to look at it in categories or areas of interest, there was a lot of silly. There's been a great focus on austerity and how the cuts are going to impact on social security. There was a number of bills in there focused on devolution, England, Scotland, well, the cities in England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And the third area that I think is going to be a huge theme across this Parliament is civil liberties and human rights. I think there's at least 4 or 5 different pieces of legislation that are all going through the Home Office. And just from a quick skim read, they're all incredibly authoritarian. You've got the proposals to scrap the Human Rights Act. You've got proposals for obviously more intelligence gathering and outsourcing that effectively to private telecommunications firms. You've got the extremism bill about kind of redefining areas around freedom of speech to criminalise people. So it's incredibly concerning. I was speaking to Shami Chakrabarti today from the Liberty Campaign Group about all of those pieces of legislation. And in my opinion, they've scored a huge victory in managing to delay the human rights repeal till at least later in this Parliament. That was a victory for the SNP, for Labour, for the Runnymede Tories, who are obviously like David Davis and Andrew Mitchell that are pro civil liberties.
Can you put it? What were the Runnymede Tories? I mean, I know that Runnymede was where the Magna Carta was signed, but they're Tories that are more kind of libertarian in a certain way? I mean, is that a fair characterization?
Yes. So there's a group like Andrew Mitchell, I believe Ken Clark, Dominic Grieve, and might have missed someone out there who there was an anonymous member of the cabinet who also said they were prepared to resign over the Human Rights Act and the Telegraph. So it was a Tory rebellion that has caused Michael Gove and the Tories to shelve repealing the Human Rights Act for now and to promise more consultation, even though in 5 years in the last government, they obviously failed to repeal it when they were in government with the Lib Dems. So it's in my view.
And did they announce their intention to do that 5 years ago of repealing human rights?
I think it was part of the 2010 Tory manifesto, but obviously as part of the coalition, they couldn't get support for it. Like they had a commission on abolishing the Human Rights Act. They've had lots of, I think there's been at least 6 or 7 different drafts by the Ministry of Justice. So obviously what they announced yesterday was further consultation because they don't have the votes in Parliament to repeal it at the moment. So the view of Liberty was that they are not complacent and that they think there's still a risk that it will come back and they might be able to force it through. But there's just wider threats to civil liberties from those other pieces of legislation that show that the government's quite intent to say "Je suis Charlie" when it suits, and then to censor, to push through a snooper's charter, and to take away people's human rights when it suits them in government.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to bring that up with you, Craig, because that goes well with my next question. Is why would any government want to revoke the European Convention on Human Rights? What do they want to do that they can't do now because of it? And for me, it's just like, what's going on? Oh, what do they say? Oh, well, we could only do this if we didn't have this pesky, European Convention of Human Rights. How do you see it? I mean, what would they want to do that they can't do because the Human Rights Convention is there?
It is slightly worrying. I mean, when you consider that within the last 2 years, they had people detained without trial in Belmarsh prison, detained without trial and without charge as terrorists for years, who weren't even told what the allegations were against them. They've been in a seat of intelligence through torture from the Extraordinary Rendition Program. GCHQ has had programs of mass trawling and surveillance of millions of people, including having screenshots of hundreds of thousands of people's private sex chats, which are stored in Cheltenham, and they've managed to do all that with the Human Rights Act in place. So the question of what more they want to do by getting rid of it is quite interesting. I don't actually think it is that they have a particular agenda that they think is likely to be thwarted by the Human Rights Act, because rather sadly, we have seen, by and large, we have seen judiciaries worldwide in the so-called free world have kowtowed to government when it comes to the security agenda. We have British courts now. We have some trials entirely in secret in London now involving terrorism offences. We have regularly trials in which there's evidence which the defence are not allowed to see, intelligence from intelligence sources which is not revealed to the defence. We have a situation where in some trials involving intelligence, the defence doesn't have a free choice of its lawyer. Only certain government-cleared lawyers are allowed to be the defence lawyer. So, we have appalling limitations of freedom that have already been accepted by the judges and which haven't been successfully challenged in Europe. So it always slightly worries me that people, and I include Liberty in this incident, people often don't realise that judges can actually be part of the structure of oppression. We too often, and don't get me wrong, I'm entirely against repealing the Human Rights Act, and I'm entirely in favour of the European Convention of Human Rights. But sadly, judges, given who judges are and where they come from within society, are very often part of the oppression. And I think that's something we didn't ought to totally lose sight of either.
Okay. All right. And how do you see this going forward? I mean, over the next 5 years, if England, with 55 million people and most of the population, votes to leave, and you're going to tell Gibraltar that they have to leave the EU, and they're right there next to Spain. You've got Northern Ireland, and with precarious relations with Southern Ireland. Wales that may not want to leave it, to leave it all. Scotland that doesn't want to leave. I mean, I just don't see how the UK could survive something like that. But I would love to get both of your thoughts on that. You know, how could the UK survive if there is an EU referendum and not all the members of the family of nations vote to leave, and some of them are brought out of the EU against their will? How do you see that playing out?
I think it would. It's already been mentioned by Nicola Sturgeon and others. That's one of the material changes that would create the need for a second referendum on independence. I've not seen anyone hotly dispute that, and I think there's been a lot of people who were on the no side, who I've personally spoken to, have said that would be a deal breaker for them. That they're quite, they wouldn't want Scotland to leave the EU. So I think that's one issue, but I also think, even to relate it back to the Human Rights Act discussion, the UK is in a constant state of constitutional crisis now. Another reason that the Human Rights Act repeal has been delayed is because the Scottish government said that they were going to refuse legislative consent at Holyrood, that they were taking legal advice on how to fight repeal of the Human Rights Act. It's embedded into the Scotland Act. It's embedded into the Belfast Agreement with the Irish government. So there was issues for the Northern Irish peace process, and
the Welsh devolutionary settlement as well. Yeah.
So you've got the fragmented sort of policy impacts of all these decisions by the Tories is already creating constitutional clashes. And this is so early, the first a couple of weeks after the election, we're already seeing these schisms open up, and that's going to intensify over issues around social security. Sinn Féin were refusing to pass the welfare bill at Stormont in Northern Ireland. That was another case where they were saying we're not going to implement Tory cuts. So I think that's going to crop up time and time again, where Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland are going to say there is no Tory mandate to impose these policies throughout the United Kingdom.
Craig, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, a couple of things. No, I agree with everything Michael just said, and a lot was said in Scotland about the fact that the Scottish Parliament would have a certain leverage on the European Convention on Human Rights. But one thing which I think there hasn't been quite enough discussion of is the international ramifications, which of course interests me as a former diplomat. It's not entirely clear that by repealing or replacing the Human Rights Act, that a necessary concomitant is that you resile from the convention itself, because you don't need a Human Rights Act to be part of the convention. It doesn't necessarily need to be enacted in primary legislation. And that's, in a sense, a much bigger step. I mean, if you're actually withdrawing from the Convention on Human Rights, I don't think you can actually be a member of the Council of Europe nowadays without being a signatory of the European Convention of Human Rights. Certainly, they have an identical membership. I think even Russia is a signatory of the European Convention on Human Rights. That would be sending an extraordinary international signal. And at the very least, even if we could remain as a member of the Council of Europe, which I'm not at all sure we could, and it would have knock-on effects into the OSCE, for example, it would affect Britain's diplomatic standing in big ways, as well as, of course, sending the most terrible signal worldwide, where anything we say on human rights to dictatorial regimes would never be taken seriously again. So just the international impact of it would be absolutely appalling. But to quickly switch to the the wider subject, yes, I mean certainly, I think Britain withdrawing from the European Union would be. I've no doubt that would spark Scottish independence in quite a short time. Not just that it would spark another referendum, but that referendum would be won. I would argue actually that the European Convention on Human Rights is so, and the Human Rights Act is so fundamental, and is indeed enshrined in the devolution referendum, that withdrawing repealing the Human Rights Act would also be a material change that should trigger a referendum. That seems to be, there's nothing more fundamental than human rights. It seems to me that if a government's tampering with that in itself should trigger a referendum. And on the much broader point, I think the very fact, that you have the SNP triumphant in Scotland on a platform that was well to the left of the Labour Party platform, and you have, a Conservative government on a manifesto that's well to the right, elected in the United Kingdom. I think the union is gone. It's only a matter of how much time it takes to break it up, pure and simple.
Okay, good. Well, that ties into the next thing that I want to talk about. Just very quickly, is there anything else you want to say on the European question before I go on to the new SNP presence in Westminster?
I'm good.
Okay. So we have now 56 new, SNP members out of 59 Scottish MPs. As you well know, during the election campaign, Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP offered to work with Labour if they would constitute a majority, as opposed to the Tories, in what I view personally is one of the most boneheaded moves on Miliband's part. He refused and caved into the kind of English nationalist pressure to refuse to work with Scotland, who wanted to quote break apart the UK. And I think I have no polls to cite or any, but I have that intuition that I think a lot of people in England probably watched that and said, well, what does he want then? But in any case. So I've seen a little bit of the punditry say, well, okay, they got the SNP has 56 seats, but the Tories have a majority. They are the third largest party, but they're only less than a tenth of the overall thing. So they don't, their presence is meaningless. They can always be overruled. But on the other hand, maybe there are a lot of opportunities for a cohesive SNP to make a real difference. How do you see it?
There are both opportunities and limitations for the opposition group of SNP MPs that exist now at Westminster. In practical policy terms, from outside the government, they can challenge, they can win concessions. It's to be determined what those concessions will be. I think at the moment, it's looking like they might make only limited gains, in the sense that the Tories look like they're planning to steamroll over sort of devolved discontent. But I think obviously that carries huge risks in the medium term that Craig's just outlined. If they go ahead with imposing all these policies, the sort of ace card that the SNP hold is when they come forward with the possibility of another referendum. And you can tell from the commentary, the sort of party hack commentary, that's what they're terrified of. That's why even before the general election, a lot of people on the Labour and Tory side were already talking up a second referendum. It's because they'd quite like Sturgeon and the SNP to categorically rule that out. Because they know that the possibility of a second referendum would obviously pose huge challenges to the integrity of the UK state, and it would put a great deal of uncertainty over the future of the union again. So the SNP have that power in their hands about when they think that's suitable, but obviously they can't call it too early. So it puts the 56 in a difficult position where the greatest influence they have, or the greatest play they can make, isn't one that can be made too soon. It at least comes out of the Scotland Bill, which was obviously introduced today again after the Smith Commission wrangling. And obviously that will be disappointing and will be incomplete. But it opens up a number of contradictions and opportunities for the SNP to exploit and to make it clear to the people in Scotland that you're not getting what you voted for. And that the progressive opportunities are incredibly limited for the Westminster system. So it's difficult. It's quite early. I spoke to a number of SNP MPs and a number of the new left-wing Labour MPs about ideas of sort of progressive cooperation. And a number of them were also of the opinion that it's quite early to tell how those relationships will develop. But there's important work to be done there. Like, there was a lot of people talking the talk before the general election about the idea of UK-wide progressive change and how left-wing people in the independence movement can work with people who are on the left of the Labour Party, who are socialist and oppose all austerity and want nuclear disarmament. And those people are in the Labour Party. There's a small group of them, and I think the SNP should be trying to work well with those people to set an example.
But also the majority is very narrow. What is it, 12 seats or so? Because I know that Cameron with the Liberal Democrats had a much more comfortable majority than he enjoys at this point. I mean, do you think that and so if he just gets a few Tory defections on anything, it would be very difficult to get anything done. And I think that if there is some kind of unified opposition, at least to certain issues, that maybe maybe SNP can be an important driving force. Any ideas on that, Craig?
Well, I think that's a little optimistic, because you have to issue, and you have to remember that you have a Labour Party which is going into a leadership election now, in which the leadership contenders are all striving to see who can be the most, neoliberal in economic policy and neoconservative in foreign policy, and saying that David Miliband was too left wing and we have to go back to the policies of Tony Blair. So getting a united opposition has a difficulty, but you're dealing with a very right-wing Labour Party as the majority of the opposition. And I have friends like Jeremy Corbyn, Paul Flynn in the Labour Party who are definitely on the left, but they are definitely a minority. There may be certain issues, the Human Rights Act is obviously one of them, where you might be able to get together a consolidated opposition, but getting an opposition it's all coming from the same direction on most issues is going to be very difficult. And you find on things like Trident, the Labour Party will support the Tories, and on an awful lot of votes which might be close, you would find there are people, right-wing people in the Labour Party, who will be outbalancing any Tory rebels. I think we shouldn't be, it's great having 56 SNP MPs, but we have a very weak parliamentary system and a very powerful executive. We have a very weak select committee system. The ability of people in Parliament to actually do much shouldn't be overrated. Now, I'm a little worried about expectations being high. It's certainly that there are possibilities within Parliament, as I say, to highlight, particularly on the devolution proposals, to a certain amount of grandstanding and highlighting their inadequacy. But we shouldn't expect too much from our 56 SNP MPs. I don't think that's I don't think that the SNP members of Parliament and what the SNP members of Parliament do is actually going, in retrospect, to appear terribly relevant to the way we achieved independence. One point I'd like to make is that the vote which the SNP achieved at just under 50% was almost exactly the same as the percentage of people to support independence. Reading James Kelly's Scott Goes Pop blog today, which everyone should read every day. It's an excellent blog. He has the latest opinion polls showing, I think, 49% pro-independence. And there's been, at no stage since the referendum, has there been a gap of more than 2% between support for the SNP and support for the people, and support for independence. There's rather a myth that the SNP has a large block of voters who aren't pro-independence. Actually, not true at all. That SNP vote was almost entirely a pro-independence vote. And what those people want to see is independence. They're not, the vast majority of them aren't especially institutionally committed to the SNP. What they're committed to is independence, and the SNP seems like the best way to get it, which is where I come from personally as well. So I think, coming up, looking forward to Holyrood, I don't think the SNP is going to have any choice at the end of the day. They're going to have a second referendum in their manifesto, because if they don't, they're going to get outflanked by other pro-independence people supporting, a faster route to independence. I think the age of gradualism is behind us. I think we've now reached takeoff point.
Okay, good. Okay, moving on from there, Alistair Carmichael. Craig, you knew him. How do you read this whole episode of him apparently having? I mean, first of all, I mean, you were in diplomacy. How do you read that whole episode?
Well, it's been a fascinating episode. I mean, I still think we're not at the bottom of who actually wrote that minute and why a minute putting forward something so wildly improbable ever got produced by the civil service, because civil servants, by and large, have more sense than to produce that kind of thing. So I'm still suspicious about the entire genesis of the minute, let alone how Carmichael came to be leaking it. I'm very sorry about it, Alistair. I've known Alistair since student days and had had a pint with him on many occasions, and he's genuinely actually a nice person. At least he used to be genuinely a nice person. I presume he still is. For me, this is a sign of how the power structures drag you in and corrupt you, and how even a genuinely pleasant and well-motivated person could get more and more sucked by ministerial power, everything that goes along with it, by the status, the money, the ministerial limousines. You lose your ethical compass, and it seems to happen to so very many people. And Alistair's not the only person I saw it happen to. When I was within the Foreign Office, I saw people get involved in the invasion of Iraq, in promulgating the dossier on weapons of mass destruction when they absolutely knew it wasn't true. People I knew did that. I saw people get involved in administering, torture and extraordinary rendition program and receiving intelligence from it, and they knew what they were doing. They did it openly, but these weren't horrible people. They were nice people I'd known for many, many years. I knew their families, their children. The system sucks you in. The system can suck you in. The system corrupts you. Power corrupts you. And we have to look seriously at our systems of governance and the way they work and the way that they distort people's ethical balance. Because Alistair did something terribly wrong. There's no doubt about that. And Alistair should resign. I'm quite clear about that. But you've not just got to look at him and say, oh, it's a bad individual in a good system. It's not. It's a rotten system making good people bad.
Okay. I'd like to get back into this in just a minute, but Michael, would you like to add anything about the Alistair Carmichael thing from what you've seen down there in Westminster?
Well, as you do, you bump into a lot of folk and you recognise people in the street all over the place. So I felt like I was kind of Scottish MP spotting. So obviously saw a lot of the SNP bunch because they're everywhere. I saw Ian Murray. I even stopped David Mundell in the street and asked him for an interview. Fingers crossed on that one. But the person I didn't see anywhere was Alistair Carmichael. So I don't know whether he's in hiding somewhere or just taking some time off. I think the leak itself and the truthfulness of the leak is one issue in itself, and there's a lot of leaking goes on in politics from different parties. But it was the fact he covered it up and lied about it when the investigation was launched, and obviously the timing of that alongside the general election just made it a kind of powder keg moment to lie and cover that up for so long. I do think makes his position untenable.
Okay, all right. And Craig, a lot of what ails the British system, not everything, but a lot of it could be helped by having a much more codified written constitution, something that is able to say, to specify much more clearly what parliamentary procedure is, what basic fundamental rights are, what basic human rights are, all of these things. And I'm always wondered why. I don't know. It's as if being in the United States, we sort of worship our Constitution. It's our queen. It's our monarchy kind of thing. But why do you I mean, but it's almost as if there's not even any real discussion about it. That, why don't the British have a better system that's based on something much more codified than this kind of bizarre parliamentary sovereignty system that exists? What do you think is why is there such a reluctance to try to make something better, and codify things more than they are, including rights, parliamentary procedure, etc.?
I mean, it's fascinating on many levels. It's fascinating that only 37% of the people who voted Conservative. 37%. With votes of 37%, you can get an overall majority. And that 37%, of course, is only 23% of the registered electorate. And the registered electorate in themselves aren't the entire population. But the system is just accepted. It goes on. But a huge proportion of people are alienated from this rather peculiar political system. My own view is that we've inherited the structures of power that ran an empire, and an empire which was much more rapacious and unpleasant and evil than most people are prepared to admit, even to themselves. It's fascinating to watch the Queen there in all her jewelry sitting on the throne. If you know something of the history of where those diamonds came from, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, for example, which was looted by the British from the Sikhs. Now, the Sikhs had actually looted it from the Afghans, who had looted it from the Mughals. So you can go back in the history of it. But we actually looted it from the Sikhs after the first Afghan war, after the Sikh war, where we invaded the Punjab, took the country, killed literally hundreds of thousands of people, vast amounts of rape by British forces, vast amounts of pillage, and we stole the Sikh crown jewels, literally. And that now is on display as the glittering centerpiece of the crown, and the fact that it was got by rape and pillage and murder is something no one seems to worry about. We have these power structures, and that symbolizes, in a sense, the way that the structures of the British state are based on this vast governance of the imperial empire. The structures of state haven't changed since, and since then have come to be funded and sustained by the corrupt sources of wealth in the City of London, by the finance sector and by the corporate bodies that finance our politicians. So the whole damn structure is rotten in every way. It needs to be fundamentally changed. But in my view, that doesn't just involve a written constitution. And a written constitution is a great thing, but I come back again to what I said earlier, that a written constitution is enforced by judges, and how useful it is depends on who the judges are. And at the moment, they're not terrifically representative of society either. But we have to break down. We have to get away from the City of London. We have to get away from the corrupt banking system. We really need to see changes in our society that are much more fundamental and revolutionary than the necessary underpinnings of the political constitution, and that involves breaking down the UK state into smaller and more coherent units.
Okay, I do want to ask a follow-up question, but Michael, do you have anything on that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most crucial truths to understand about Scottish politics and about UK politics. That constitutional change and social change are two sides of the same coin. And to fail to understand the constitutional structures, the corrupt constitutional structures of the UK state, its history and its present usage, is to fail to understand the entire political system and the alienation of the people from that system. Like, even the debate I was at tonight was referring to how the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency was ignored by the Ministry of Defence over radiation leaks at Dounreay. And the reason it was ignored was that the Ministry of Defence used Crown powers, or powers that were originally invested in the monarch and the monarchy about control of information, not to release that information to the sort of Scottish public body that deals with environmental protection. This was raised by Alex Salmond countless times, 3 or 4 times, to the government minister, asking, will you change this, or say that you'll no longer use these powers to conceal information? and obviously it was ignored time and time again because powers, the original royal prerogatives and all that, are quite useful for any sitting executive to use if it's in cases of war or in cases of concealing information or in countless other political examples. So the constitutional structure is vital for maintaining political power, and unless you change those constitutional structures, you're going to be severely limited in how you improve society in a huge diversity of public policy areas.
Yeah, good. I wanted to get back. I wanted to follow on, Craig, with what you were talking about. Is the way that people learn history about who they are and what their country is. And I grew up in the United States. We had this very kind of fairy tale image of a way that we came about. But it's very much predicated on the notion that before 1776 there was this oppressive George V, and then these great patriots rebelled, and then America became free, and they've been free ever since. I mean, I'm well aware of the the kind of the fairy tale nature of that, but in more recent years, even just in the last 20, since I was in grade school in the 70s and, learning about, American history, a lot has come up, and things about, for example, Thomas Jefferson having slaves, George Washington having slaves, Thomas Jefferson having a child with one of his slaves, this type of thing, which really can, shake these kind of foundational notions that we have. And I was just wondering, in Britain, is anything similar going on? It's not like we've come to a complete reconciliation with our past and slavery and all that, but I do detect that Americans are going that way and beginning to really grasp the brutality of their history in a way that I'm not sure is being done in the UK. And I was just wondering, you both as, living in the UK and all that, how you see that. Is there any kind of beginnings of reckoning with the imperial past, or is it just still glossed over in this kind of superficial way, hoping that people don't look into it too deeply?
No, I think it's entirely glossed over. And worse than that, I actually think it's becoming worse. There was, even at the time of empire, there was quite a strong anti-imperial intellectual tradition among the British intellectual elite, and that became obviously the dominant mood in the 1940s and 50s as empire crumbled. Since that, you really see nothing but nostalgia. And worse than that, you have an increasing militarism in British society to an extent that there never has been before. One example
So would you repeat that, please? You cut out for a second. Please repeat what you said, because it's important.
There's an increasing militarism in British society to a greater extent than ever before. So that, for example, at key football matches or rugby internationals or whatever, you'll have the flag borne in by soldiers marching in military uniform, which would never have happened in my youth, and now happens on almost every public occasion. And there's a devoted, a slavish worship of the military in the tabloid media, which feeds into things. You have, and everybody wants wounded veterans to be well treated, but the constant promotion of causes like Help for Heroes are a part of the increasing militarization or the increasing march of militarism in society. One example I like to give of how we've actually become a worse society in this sense. Back at the absolute height of empire, here where I am in Midlothian in 1880, during the Midlothian campaign, Gladstone, who was leader of the opposition campaigning to become prime minister again, he made a speech in which he said that during the Second Afghan War, he said British troops were driving Afghan women and children into the snows of winter to perish. And if they resist, if the Afghans resist, would you not do the same? Now, it would be unthinkable nowadays for the leader of the opposition to say, if the Afghans or Iraqis or the Libyans are fighting our invading troops, would you not do the same? It would be impossible for a politician on the mainstream party to admit that the people fighting British troops were in the right. was Gladstone, conducted an entire campaign saying the Afghan resistance to our invasion are right, and if the Afghans invaded here, you'd fight them too. You couldn't say that now. You'd be drowned down by a militaristic furore. The space for debate, the ability to oppose what our troops are doing abroad, has disappeared from public discourse. Sorry, that was a rather esoteric.
But it fits into what a lot with what I've seen.
Important point.
It fit just quickly before I go to Michael. It fits in with a lot of what I've seen in the United States too. I mean, I always would want to say to folks, if Chinese troops had taken over Dallas, Texas, do you think a few rednecks would get out their guns and shoot them off? I mean, they were like, hell, of course. But that's the whole point. But the thing is, the subject isn't even brought up. Like, well, what if you were being bombed? What if you were being shot at? You just lie over and say, oh, well, there's the British and they're always right, or the Americans are always right. So, I mean, I certainly get your point. Michael, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the media and political establishment's number one aim, to simplify, is to maintain a consensus. A consensus of ideas can be incredibly powerful. And as Craig's outlined, having a consensus of ideas on war and militarism and British nationalism is vital for the UK political establishment. And you see that in a fairly recent example about four or 5 months ago, when there was that campaign organisation that said the security services, UK security services and interventions had been responsible for radicalisation. And it was around the Jihadi John stuff with ISIS, and they challenged the mainstream or the establishment consensus that radicals, like people that were taken to violence, were obviously dangerous and crazy, and they challenged that and said that these people had been radicalized by forms of persecution or by being followed, by being spied upon, by pressure and intimidation from state officials. And that sounds like a perfectly plausible description or debate to have. If you go about in a heavy-handed way in certain communities, isn't that more likely to radicalize people and turn them against the state? And for that description, for showing any sort of sense of intellectual or emotional understanding towards those people, there was a mass media campaign to demonize the people involved in that group, to cut off their funding, to not speak to those people, to not associate with that campaign group anymore. That was actually quite successful with some public bodies to say they'd no longer deal with this group because they had a different conception about sort of intimidation and what was happening in Iraq and Syria. And you can see through those type of events how powerful political consensus is, a consensus of ideas that sets a very tightly controlled spectrum of opinion on these central political issues and says this far and no further. And if you take a slightly different approach on these issues, you're sort of castigated and thrown out of the political mainstream. To relate it back to the previous discussion, that's one thing that they can do. It's to broaden the spectrum of acceptable opinion and ideas in areas where it's currently incredibly narrow. So tonight, an adjournment debate on the dangers of Trident nuclear weapons to the safety and security of people in the UK. And William McNeely's leaks about and report about the dangers of Trident nuclear weapons and the lack of security in place changes the debate. It changes the idea that weapons of mass destruction are a deterrent, and hopefully starts to create the idea and discussion that weapons of mass destruction are a huge danger to people in Scotland, and especially to people in Faslane and Helensburgh, who should be very concerned about the existence of poorly guarded missile systems on their doorstep. And so that's one thing. Changing that consensus of ideas is a daily challenge for everyone that's involved in politics and the media. And I think it's one that should be top of the SNP's priority list.
Yeah, maybe I'm assuming you've watched Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consensus, but that's basically his thesis on the whole thing. And what do you think constructs that? I mean, when Chomsky talks about it, it's the corporate media, the corporate elite that narrow what they own the media and they narrow it down to this very narrow bandwidth of what is considered acceptable debate. And if you go beyond that, you're gone, or you're not invited back. Is that what you've seen, Craig? Do you see the media, kind of framing it in that way? And just when you watch the BBC, STV, or read the basic newspapers, you're in this little box and they can't really go out of it in terms of debate, at least for important political issues.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. If I can, relate this to personal experience.
Sure.
I used to go an awful lot. Shortly after I left the Foreign Office, for 2 or 3 years, I would go several times a week onto the mainstream broadcast media as a pundit. Then all of a sudden, it stopped, and it stopped from a way where I was still, I'd done it about 20 times in the preceding month. Then it just stopped immediately, all at once, stopped completely. And from that time, several years ago, I've been phoned by the BBC, by BBC producers or production staff, and booked for programs on literally dozens of occasions, 30 or 40 consecutive times. And then I'm always cancelled just before the show.
I had that honor once too, at least once. I had that honor as well. They called me on to talk about Scotland and Europe, and in the Newsnet I'd written some articles saying they can't kick them out. I mean, they're EU citizens, they can't do that. And I got invited once. It was all set up. Oh, sorry, we don't need you. You got bumped. So I'm with you.
Yeah, no, 30 or 40 consecutive occasions it's happened. The one which I was saddest about was I was actually invited to take part in Question Time. This was quite, when this all started some years ago. And I was actually rather looking forward to take part on Question Time and giving them a much more radical perspective than they normally have. My views are what I've given this evening. I don't have any more radical or strange or peculiar views that I may inflict upon the nation. But plainly, I'm just viewed as not within that consensus, which they are so eager to maintain. I will say, one thing I thought Nicola Sturgeon did very well. I was delighted watching the leaders' debate on television. The main one in which she participated of all the party leaders. It was the only time for years that I've heard opposition to Trident expressed on mainstream TV, even though that's actually a view held by quite a large percentage of the population. Your chances of getting, having anyone opposed to Trident getting on mainstream primetime TV were virtually nil. And it was great to hear that. And yes, we do have in the SNP now a chance to broaden the debate a little.
Okay. Michael, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I suppose there's two things. Like one, if you take the William McNeely example, you have the case of someone who, in a different political scenario, could have been facing serious jail time for putting all this information out, which could have been seen to breach the Official Secrets Act, who is being lauded as a courageous hero by figures high up in the Scottish government, by the third biggest political party in the UK, and someone who's done something quite brave and quite challenging to a lot of institutions. And it's just interesting how someone like that, who in a different political situation could have been like cast and cut adrift and demonised, is now kind of held up by these political forces, because obviously it happens to coincide with a number of the SNP's established interests about disarmament and about Scotland and about security. So that's one example where you can see a debate changing when the balance of forces changes. But I agree with Craig's general analysis of how especially some of the broadcasters operate in a very controlled, conservative manner. And it isn't always explicit. I think there's just an implicit understanding across people who operate in the media of certain things that will make you stand out, and therefore it's a risk to go through with that, because you know that access can be restricted, you won't be invited back. All agendas, for instance, for discussions on the media are quite tightly controlled previously by producers, by editors, by people above those editors. There's hierarchies in place to make sure that things follow a system. And if any show or anything like that deviates from what's expected, there are people in place to make sure that things are brought back into line. Even from my own experience, just watching how BBC Scotland covered something that Common Space had written a lot about, which was protests and hunger strikes of detainees at detention centres, people who were seeking asylum and some people who were just migrants to the UK. And we did a lot of reporting, and Liam O'Hare, who's one of the staff at Common Space, went into Dungavel detention centre where some of this was taking place, and he spoke to a lot of people about the hunger strike. It's quite a drastic action to take, and did a lot of great reporting, and this was reported elsewhere. But on quite a couple of occasions, that aspect of the story was just removed from the BBC Scotland reporting. And I don't blame the individual journalists for that. As Craig was outlining earlier about Alistair Carmichael telling the truth, it's often not the individual journalists at fault for that system in Scotland and BBC UK-wide, which puts pressure on people to invest greater trust in establishment sources. In this case, it was the Home Office, and the Home Office denied point blank that any hunger strike was taking place. And there's just implicit pressure on journalists, if you work for a corporate or established media group, to invest a lot of faith in groups like the Home Office, and to doubt the lived experiences of refugees or asylum seekers who were on strike. And I think that it says quite a lot about how the media operates when you look down into these individual examples and see what information is allowed through the net and what isn't allowed through the net.
What's filtered in and what's filtered out, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to begin to wrap this up, but I did have a couple questions from the audience. Anne Hill, what would happen if Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland do not adhere to the Tories' dissolution of the human rights? So if the other members of the family of nations don't want to dissolve the Human Rights Convention, is there a way they could do it? I mean, if Michael Gove was so into it that he said, okay, well, we can't get Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, but at least in England, we're going to get rid of the Human Rights Act. Is that even conceivable?
I mean, it's technically conceivable in terms of a Human Rights Act, but not the European Convention of Human Rights, which has to be entered into by a sovereign state, which at the moment is only the UK. I mean, I can't see it as a way they would want to go, but it is technically conceivable that you could make it apply to the Human Rights Act. You could abolish the Human Rights Act in England, but have it still applying in other parts of the UK. Yeah, it's a technical possibility.
Okay. Other one from Q Baz, if I'm reading this correctly. Maybe there are only 56 Scottish, SNP MPs, but surely they can set the tone and therefore have an influence. I think we've talked about that, but I mean, even though there are only 56 among 650 MPs, can they set the tone and have an influence? Michael?
I think it's way too early to tell. There's already been these few small examples of the delay in the human rights repeal, of obviously the discussions between Cameron and Sturgeon over the Scotland bill and further devolution, and obviously the debates that are going to continue over the issue like Trident today that was in the House of Commons. So you've had small examples of where there's obviously this conflict of people who claim different mandates and authority, and it's too early to tell. Salmond, for instance, has been quite bullish in saying that Cameron has a smaller majority than John Major had when he came back in the early 90s, and if that happened, if there was a breakdown, in Cameron's majority, and you got into a hung parliament situation, then yes, the SNP's possible influence and power in that situation would soar. That, after all, is what the general election campaign was based on, the possibilities of a hung parliament situation. But I think it's just way too early to tell at the moment how politics will play out. The 2016 Scottish election, another independence referendum, all those issues are there to be contested during the Parliament, and I think that will determine what the 56 are there for. Just to expand on what I was just saying, I think as well, it's interesting how the SNP can use the resources at Westminster as well to think medium term, beyond sort of just any set political outcome. Speaking to George Kerevan today, for instance, he was talking about obviously a lot of the economic work they're going to be doing, and I think it's important to consider that the SNP still need to win the economic case for independence. Obviously, like the full fiscal autonomy argument and the argument over the currency would crop back up again if there was going to be a second referendum. And I think there has to be a lot more work done on policy and on issues like job creation and on how you can have a higher wage economy in Scotland, and how you'd have a different approach to a Scottish currency in an independent Scotland. So I think the SNP will also put a lot of their Westminster resources that they have now, with 56 MPs, a lot of extra staff, a lot of money, the short money, as it's called at Westminster, that they now qualify for, into those areas of economic research. And I think that's vital for the wider independence movement that happens. So there's a credible and intelligent case for another referendum when it happens.
I'll just say I'm strangely optimistic to the future. I think we're going to go for a rough time. We've got 5 years of the Tories. Our ability to stop them imposing a programme is limited. There's really not an awful lot that can be done to stop the welfare cuts that are coming, going to hurt a lot of people, and to stop the endangerment of the UK's international position. But on the other hand, I remain very, very optimistic that we're going to achieve independence even before the end of those 5 years, or at least to be clearly on the way, having won a referendum by the end of those 5 years. I will say that actually the result that scared me in a way was the idea, which was so many people's aim during the election, of a Labour government in London supported by the SNP. I actually think a Labour government supported in London by the SNP was perhaps the only thing that could have stopped Scottish independence happening within the next decade. I think independence is coming, and we're going to have to fight hard and struggle long and make plain our opposition to the Tories, but it's going to lead to the right place in the end.
I can see that too. I just think there's so many political train wrecks that are going to happen that Scotland just can't stick around. But anyway, and how do you see it, Michael?
Yeah, I think we have the most extreme right-wing government in living memory. The social security cuts are going to be painful. The austerity measures are going to be unpopular. The attacks on civil liberties and public services are going to be devastating. The attempt to impose Trident on Scotland for another generation is going to be divisive. The election in 2016 is coming down the road quite quickly as well. And you put all of those factors together and you see a very divided kingdom. And I agree with Craig that ultimately that makes independence highly likely.
Okay, well, I'd like to wrap up this first edition of Talking Heads. I want to thank Craig and Michael for being with us, and would like you all to come back anytime you want to contribute to our ongoing conversation. Good night to the audience, and hope you like it. And let us know, all of us. Let us know of your thoughts about our show, and if you have other guests you'd like to suggest, please pass them on. Good night.
Night.
Thank you.